Continetti, Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Affordability is top of mind for American voters. Rising costs, particularly in the housing sector, occupy our attention. In June, a 33-year-old self-described Democratic socialist won a stunning upset in the New York City mayoral primary. Why? In part because of his pledge to freeze rents and lower prices. And yet, amid the calls for government price controls and more affordable housing, one rarely hears plans to bulldoze entire neighborhoods and replace them with government-designed projects. In his new book, The Projects, A New History of Public Housing, our guest today explains why. Howard Husock is a senior fellow in domestic policy studies, where he focuses on municipal government, urban housing policy, civil society, and philanthropy. Before joining AEI, Howard was vice president for research and publications at the Manhattan Institute in New York. He has also been a director of case studies in public policy and management at the Harvard Kennedy School, a member of the board of directors of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and a journalist and Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker. Howard was a mid-career fellow at Princeton University's Woody Woo School, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He holds a BS from Boston University's School of Public Communication. His books include The Poor Side of Town and Why We Need It, Who Killed Civil Society, Philanthropy Under Fire, and America's $1 trillion housing mistake. The Projects details the tragic rise and fall of public housing and the pitfalls of other subsidy programs. Husock traces how, despite the government's lofty ideals, the creation of the projects led to the destruction of low-income communities across the country. From the Hill District in Pittsburgh to Black Bottom in Detroit, predominantly black neighborhoods were judged only by the quality of their housing. Husock looks beyond these neighborhoods' physical conditions to their uncounted riches, from local artists to vital communal institutions. What makes this book unique, in my view, is its emphasis on people. Both the progressive planners who used social engineering to impose a preconceived notion on urban landscapes, and the men and women whose lives were uprooted and changed forever by the planners' designs. My plan for this session is to spend the next 45 minutes or so in conversation with Howard to take us through the book and to talk about some contemporary implications. And then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. We plan to wrap things up by 6:15 p.m. If you have a question and you are watching us online, please send your inquiries to hadar.zeevi@aei.org. That's spelled hadar.zeevi@aei.org. And I'll remind you of that email when we approach the question period. Right, now let's get started. Welcome, Howard.
Thanks, Matthew.
So I'd like to begin by asking you, what question were you trying to answer when you started this particular book?
Well, I think my question, putting on a historian's hat, was how in the world did public housing happen in the United States? This is, as everybody knows, a country of homeowners. Franklin Roosevelt, who started public housing, celebrated the United States as a country of homeowners. And yet, he was steered into doing something that was utterly contrary to the idea of single-family or even 2 or 3 family home ownership on small lots. And instead, towers in the park, high-rises, making over the faces of cities. An extraordinary mystery to me how that happened. And as I began to look into it, I was stunned to find that there was no grassroots movement. There was really even no elected official campaigning on the idea of we need to have the government build and manage housing for us. It was a group of New York intellectuals, bohemians really, who planned an exhibit, believe it or not, this sounds extraordinary, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1934. They had the housing exhibition. And at this housing exhibition, they had before and after, the slums of the Lower East Side, and I use slums in quotes because, if anything, I'm a defender of slums in this book, unabashed. And then the new replacement brought to you by Macy's, right there. That was the exhibit at the museum. This was not a museum exhibit of old portraits. This was what the future was going to be. And it was sponsored by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Mrs. Arthur Ox Sulzberger, wife of the publisher of the New York Times. Nobody from the poor neighborhoods of New York who were allegedly to benefit was consulted, included in the program. All the kind of environmental reviews that we do today, unimaginable. And as a result of that vision, some of those same people then wrote the National Housing Act of 1937. They were friendly with Eleanor Roosevelt. They got FDR's ear. And even though he was lukewarm on the idea, he wanted to jumpstart the construction industry. So my question, in answer to your question, was how in the world did that happen? And it happened because it was an elite-led, intellectually led idea that happened to find fertile ground in the Depression.
I guess the historical backdrop, these ideas of kind of top-down planning, uniform living conditions, they were fairly widespread at the time, were they not?
Certainly in Europe they were, especially in Germany, and dare I say it, especially in the Soviet Union. And so Catherine Bauer, who was part of this museum exhibit, and really the intellectual leader of the public housing movement, published a book in 1936 called Modern Housing, Modern. Very much under the influence of Le Corbusier and the Radiant City. That's what they wanted to build. And in the back of the book, there are all these rotogravure pictures of what it's like in Europe and how we should emulate it, including in Moscow. So they were not averse to including Germans, essayists in their museum catalog book who were praising Hitler for what he was doing with housing in Germany. Of course, this is 1934. Nonetheless.
Now, you mentioned the Housing Act of 1937 and FDR signing it, bringing public housing into being. Can you describe, what were if there was no real grassroots calls, what were the political conditions that led FDR to sign the Housing Act?
Well, certainly the construction industry was moribund, and he was indebted to unions. He also had this interesting New Deal coalition of the progressive Northeast, and the Jim Crow South. And one of the most surprising things I found is that white Southern senators, such as Henry Steagall, later made famous by the Glass-Steagall Act, embraced the National Housing Act. They liked it. Why in the world would they have? We think of public housing as being the lakefront towers of Chicago, the Jacob Riis houses on the Lower East Side of New York. There are more than 200 public housing authorities in the small towns of the Deep South. West Point, Mississippi has its own public housing authority. Well, why did the Southerners glom onto this? They understood it. First of all, this was the beginnings of crony capitalism. So federal money would come in, developers could get on that gravy train, the subsidies would roll for construction, and somebody had to do the building, and that was the people they knew. But moreover, and I detail this in a place called New Bern, North Carolina, in a chapter in the book, they saw it as a means to enforce residential racial segregation. And many of the neighborhoods, and remember, it's not only what was built, it was what was demolished that really characterized this era of public housing. They saw it as a means, and did, slum clear racially mixed working class neighborhoods. And they built all black and all white public housing projects. When Franklin Roosevelt turned on the lights at the Techwood homes in Atlanta, literally turned on the lights, it was all white. Eleanor Roosevelt, the quintessential progressive, thought she was doing Black Americans a favor by making sure they'd be included in this beneficent project. She went to Detroit and personally cut the ribbon for the Frederick Douglass houses. the segregation of it was just intense, even down to the names. So New York has the Langston Hughes houses, the James Weldon Johnson houses. Detroit had the Frederick Douglass houses until they deteriorated and were torn down, with the implication that these would always be black residences. They're named for famous black Americans. And so I think there was a deal with the unions for the North and a deal with the racial devil in the South.
And the next, I guess, big advance was when Truman signed an additional housing act. What went into that kind of post-war period and Truman's signing of the legislation? How did that affect the creation or expansion of public housing?
Well, between 1937, when Roosevelt signed the National Housing Act, and 1949, when Truman signed its amendments, there really hadn't been that much construction. There'd been some demolition, but the war put an end to all that. It was on hold, really. Truman comes in and he injects federal funds not only to subsidize construction through the United States Housing Authority, but urban renewal, slum clearance in a big way. Truman was the one who envisioned building 800,000 units of public housing, which came close to happening. And it was Truman who provided the funds through the National Housing Act to tear down neighborhoods across the country, working class neighborhoods across the country, by the which, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research study of urban renewal, just under 50% of those neighborhoods were black that were torn down. So it was the injection of urban renewal, slum clearance. Truman, in his speech announcing it, emphasized not only what was going to be built, but what was going to be unbuilt. And it was Truman's money for slum clearance that really enabled public housing to take off.
One of the things that I think that makes this book special is your attention to the so-called slums and your descriptions of them. Give the audience a little taste of what was being destroyed when these bills were being signed.
Well, one neighborhood to think about that Washingtonians will be familiar with is Southwest Washington, which we associate with brutalist federal buildings, high-rise apartments, and kind of unfriendly local roads. A very unurban part of Washington. Well, what used to be in Southwest Washington was the heart of the black community here. And through the course of the 1950s, 23,000 households were relocated from Southwest Washington. The land was literally bulldozed. It was empty dirt in which office buildings, L'Enfant Plaza, replaced it. Among that which bit the dust, churches, barbershops, jazz clubs, 1,000, literally 1,000 black-owned businesses. And people who left were bereft. There's a whole psychological literature on those who were displaced were bereft. They'd lost their friends, they'd lost their moorings, their whole sense of community. I focus on one part of Richmond, Virginia, in which a VISTA volunteer did a sociological study of what happened after people were moved out of their neighborhood in Fulton and moved to public housing. Many of them actually died within a year. They were bereft. And so it's really fascinating. In Washington in 1950, 33% of white households were homeowners. Remember, this is before FHA mortgages, before the big suburbanization, 33%. 30% of black households were homeowners, almost equal. Their neighborhoods were the ones that were torn down. And not only were they denied their communities and, what we've now come to call social capital, but think about this. They were denied the property appreciation of what they owned, the future value of their houses, the future value of their land. They were denied that, and that happened in Southwest Washington. In the Black Bottom neighborhood of Detroit, 300 black-owned businesses taken, and a famous church, the New Bethel AME Church, where the Reverend C.L. Franklin, father of Aretha, was the minister. They took his church. So when Aretha Franklin sang the song Why I Sing the Blues, she added a verse about Negro removal. It happened to her family.
And again, I mean, I think it's just so important to underscore the intentions of the government were what? They thought that this transformation was happening to give these residents a better life ultimately, or you said in the South it was because Southern politicians understood that this might be a way to segregate the politicians. What were the population? What was this benevolent intent, even in the northern cities?
Well, certainly among the Bohemian intellectuals who led the movement, Catherine Bauer, Edith Elmer Wood, you've never heard of her. She went around the country for the National Housing Association, putting the black mark on neighborhoods that needed to come down. She lived in Gramercy Park in New York, and she traveled the country saying, this neighborhood's got to be torn down.
And the criteria was this aesthetic?
Physical conditions.
Physical conditions.
And that's my argument, is that this group of housing reformers saw the world through a narrow prism. It's kind of like public health authorities seeing COVID only through the prism of public health and not the school attendance that we're dealing with today. They viewed the physical conditions of housing. Were there some people that had to share bathrooms with other families? Yes, right? Were there some streets that weren't paved? Yes, can't deny that. Of course, the country was poorer overall. What would have happened to those neighborhoods counterfactually as the country became richer? Would those owners have sold out, gotten wealthier, fixed up their houses? Who knows? But certainly the reformers saw themselves as improving the physical conditions above all else, and only that, for those who were going to benefit.
In the book, you spend some time talking about what you call the golden age of public housing.
Yes.
Describe that for us. What was the golden age?
Well, when I do an event like this in New York, I'm going to be interviewed by a Hunter College faculty member named Nicholas Dagan Bloom, who wrote a book called When Public Housing Worked. And I think his implicit idea is if we do it right, it can work. And I'm taking issue with that in the book. But he makes a good point that there was a period of time when public housing was new, especially in the 1950s and early 60s. It was attractive. Live here, low rent. The Roosevelt administration actually put out big posters with that, as well as big posters, cross out slums, right? So if you could move from a walk-up apartment in Brooklyn to a new Queensbridge house in Queens, or the Williamsburg houses in Williamsburg, in which there was good new utilities, refrigerators, not ice boxes, the rent was subsidized, it was brand new, they just cut the ribbon. It actually competed with private housing, of course, but it was a good deal at first. And it's important to understand the predicate of how they thought it was going to work. They thought that there would be housing not for the poor that we associated with. That wasn't the plan at all. It was going to be like a public utility for working class families. They were going to be screened, and at first they were screened. You had to work 2-parent families in New York City. They were screened. And their rent would pay for the maintenance. The government bonds financing would construct the projects, but then the theory was the ongoing maintenance would be paid by the residents. So the idea that the federal government was always meant to provide operating assistance, not at all. It was not the beginning thought at all. They were going to be self-supporting. And so in the early days, when it was new, it was a golden age. And you had people in the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, which later became the site of Hoop Dreams and famous documentaries about their dereliction. They remember it fondly. But over time, things changed. Working families that had a choice moved to the suburbs en masse. They wanted their own houses. They understood that you might have had a nice place to rent in public housing, but you didn't own it. The government owned it. The prospect of wealth accumulation was not on offer. And so think about this. In 1948, Levitt and Sons built 17,000 tiny homes in Levittown, Long Island, on former potato fields. 750 square feet. They were tiny. People lined up. They flocked. Let's get out of the projects and let's move in to those. And that transformation led to the decline of the Golden Age and the replacement of the working class population with what we have today, the poorest among us.
So if we try to put brackets around the Golden Age, how long did it last? Or was the decline pretty steep?
It lasted longer in New York, where there were fewer apartment options. And the management was, New York had this history of quasi-socialism under LaGuardia. They invested in their government. They lasted for a while, maybe into the late 60s, early 70s. Mm-hmm. But think about this. The quintessential public housing project was Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. 33, count them, 33 11-story towers in a campus setting that replaced a working class black neighborhood. They cut the ribbon, and it was designed by the same architect who would later design the World Trade Center in New York. It's like star-crossed. They cut the ribbon out in 1952. It was fully occupied by 1954. By 1972, they began imploding it in a cloud of dust. It was memorialized in a famous sociological study, Life in a Federal Ghetto. So that's a period of 20 years approx from being named the Modern Building of the Year by Architectural Forum to being singled out by Richard Nixon in a 1973 special address to Congress as to the evidence for why he was placing a moratorium on new construction of public housing. Those are the brackets of the public housing movement. Truman, slum clearance, 800,000 new units, 1949. Nixon, moratorium, put a stop to it, 1973.
And that strikes me as actually pretty brief in the historical scheme of things, right?
I would say so.
Yeah, and that's what's remarkable about it. Before we talk about Nixon, I want to ask another question about aesthetics, because you just mentioned it in terms of architecture, this connection between modernism and public housing, which, again, you point out is present in that initial MoMA. It's the Museum of Modern Art.
Yeah.
They're modernist architects.
You're now going to live in a modern art museum.
Yeah. What did you learn about that connection, or did you draw any conclusions about it?
Well, it's an extraordinary, it's a coincidence in a way. You could have had public housing without modernism, but they historically collided. Mm. And the modernists, led by Le Corbusier, some of whose literal protégés designed public housing in New York, right? They wanted to remake cities generally. This was their leading edge. Le Corbusier in The Radiant City dreamed of what he called cities without streets. Cities without streets. You were going to live on this green campus. Industry would be here, shopping would be here, housing would be here, and you'd live in this green campus. And that's what they did with the projects. That was modernism let loose. And so because modernism's apex happened to coincide with the National Housing Act, these modernists were able to draw on the cities as if they were canvases. Mm.
We can't have a conversation about cities without mentioning Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. How does the power broker and his most famous critic fit into your narrative?
Right. So Moses, he was the Parks Commissioner of New York. He was the head of the Triborough Bridge Commission in New York. He was also the head of the Slum Clearance Committee in New York. And at the zenith of the public housing movement under Moses's slum clearance, wearing that hat, he was ordering and effectuating the tearing down of 60 buildings a month. A month. So think about these. These are tenements, many of them so-called, which makes them sound terrible. By the way, some of them were nice. There's a book I referenced called The Decorated Tenement. There were builders who were competing for tenants by building beautiful lobbies. The areas were self-improving, but Moses, of course, didn't see any of that. And so if you think about a 5-floor walk-up, 60 buildings a month, those are hundreds of families a month. And the projects weren't being built fast enough. These people were going on the street. You talk about gentrification and displacement. This was happening on a grand scale, fueled by Harry Truman's money. So Jane Jacobs, of course, famously collided with Moses in his highway incarnation when he wanted to build the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which was going to connect the Holland Tunnel and the Williamsburg Bridge, and cut right through the Lower East Side and Washington Square Park, iconic in New York. Jacobs organized the resistance successfully to the highway, but she did something much bigger in a sense when she wrote Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961, which is a rebuke to Moses-ism, if you will. One of the stories about Jacobs I liked the most, and I quoted in the book, was when she was writing for Architectural Forum magazine, where she advanced the ideas that became her celebration of slums in Death and Life of Great American. I mean, I count myself as a Jane Jacobs. I was fortunate to know her a little bit. I have an autographed copy of Death and Life, so it means a lot to me. You know, she went to Philadelphia to look at the urban renewal and public housing there. And she was escorted around by the Robert Moses of Philadelphia, Edmund Bacon. Ready for this? He's Kevin Bacon's father. He's 1 degree of separation.
1 degree of separation, yeah.
And he says, here's these beautiful new buildings, Jane. Well, come on, let's walk around. She says, it's all very interesting, Edmund, but where are the people? Mm-hmm. And that's it. Jacobs understood that Moses and modernism were destroyers of cities, not renewers of cities. And she was the one who first made that argument. And by 12 years later, Nixon had called a halt to public housing. I compare it to Charles Murray writing Losing Ground, and less than 20 years later, welfare reform happened.
Were there important moments in that period of time? Was there a key moment in the debate that Jacobs kind of originated or captured, and then culminating with Nixon's decision?
She gave a speech at the Harvard School of Design and let loose on all the architects there. Now, whether Nixon knew about that, I don't know or not, but it was a key moment in architectural and urban history. I think Pruitt-Igoe's implosion was the key, because Nixon mentioned that by name in his special message to Congress. And we think of Nixon, well, in all sorts of ways, but this is a very poignant speech. He talked about his empathy for the physical and social isolation of residents of housing projects. I mean, you really felt that he felt their pain, as a latter-day president would say. And so that clearly was, I think, the turning point in public housing history in the United States.
Just one more question on kind of that moment. So it wasn't just Jacobs who, her political identity is kind of very inchoate, and she came from a lot of different angles at any question she was discussing. But of course, there was a conservative critique of public housing that was building. I think of Martin Anderson's book, The Urban Bulldozer.
Urban Bulldozer, right.
Published around the same time. And then the Public Interest magazine, the site of the neoconservatives, that's launched in '65. And of course, one of its major contributors, Daniel Moynihan, becomes Nixon's domestic policy advisor for a few
That's
years
right.
in the first term. So there was definitely a critique of public housing from the right. And would you say Jacobs
I would say it was the
left?
neoconservative right, and
Okay.
and you are more than anybody is an expert in the nuances of conservatism. And it was former liberals, Crystal and Moynihan. I think the Buckley right, I don't think was particularly interested in public housing.
Mm-hmm.
In his campaign for mayor of New York against John Lindsay, he didn't mention it.
In 65.
Yeah, he mentioned welfare,
Right.
but he didn't mention public housing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's the former Trotskyites of City College who turned on public housing.
So there was a more of a left critique, you'd say, of public housing.
I would say it was domestic neoconservatives who turned on. I mean, I'm proud to have published an essay in the public interest called "Public Housing is a Poorhouse," which Nat Glaser edited.
And so, if that was where the criticism was coming from, who was defending public housing?
Yeah, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, governor of Michigan, liberal Republican. He became Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Nixon. And his idea was to have scatter site public housing. He wanted to build it in the suburbs. That would make it fair. And we see the echoes of that today with the debate about Ross Chetty and opportunity neighborhoods, moving the poor to the suburbs. Romney saw it that way. So there was a liberal Republican movement for it. And John Lindsay was all about that. John Lindsay, who wanted to build scatter site public housing in Forest Hills, Queens, working class neighborhood there. The opponents of that project in Forest Hills traveled around the country, especially to Florida, dogging Lindsay on his presidential campaign. They were so offended by him. And this will really amaze you. Lindsay appointed to work things out between the housing proponents and the neighborhood an obscure Queens lawyer, Mario Cuomo. That's how he got his start in public life. And he wrote a book, a fascinating book called Forest Hills Diary, in which he said, you know what? The more I got involved in this, the more I saw the opponent's point.
As for the residents themselves of the public housing projects, where did they stand in this debate?
I think today, if you're in a public housing project, you just want it to get fixed up and continue to live there. It's become a kind of a honey trap, right? So unlike public welfare, there's no time limit on how long you can stay in public housing. And you pay 30% of your rent. So think about this. The more income you earn, the higher your rent. So you have this powerful incentive against upward mobility. And so you have several million, 5+ million households that remain in public and otherwise subsidized housing that have, in a weird way, a good deal for them because they get to stay in this cheap apartment forever. What they want the most is for the cheap apartment to be nicer, to be like it used to be before it deteriorated. I don't think they're thinking about a bigger picture than that.
So once Nixon makes this order and we're not building any new projects, what happens to those that we have built beginning in the 1970s?
Well, two things. There's an interesting fork in the road. One, the ones that we have deteriorate and deteriorate and deteriorate because the rents have been fixed at 25% of income, later 30%, by a 1969 amendment to the National Housing Act. That effectively starved the housing authorities of the rent they thought was going to pay the bills for maintenance. So The idea that tenants were going to get a break. You only can't pay more than a quarter of your income in rent. What a good deal, except your projects would start falling down around you. So they deteriorated so much. By 1991, there was a federal commission that issued a report on what it called the extent of severely distressed public housing. And that set off a wave of demolition. Right. And we went from about 1.5 million public housing bricks and mortar units, as the advocates say, down to about 860,000 today. But there was this other fork that Nixon led us on, and that's the housing choice voucher. Think of them as housing stamps. Today, there are 2.3 million households whose rent is paid in part, 70%, by the federal government with these housing stamps, housing choice vouchers. The idea was, nobody thought about what would be the implications of handing out these housing stamps. Where would people most likely rent? Would they concentrate, just as they had concentrated in public housing projects, but in horizontal ghettos, which is a term that Barbara Mikulski, the former congressman from Baltimore, used to describe the concentrations that developed? Or, if it wasn't a good idea in the first place, maybe it was just a good idea because it was not more public housing projects. That's what drove the housing voucher movement. It wasn't new projects, so at least it was better than that. But it's become a freestanding program, very much embraced by Democrats. Maxine Waters, she's a big fan of housing vouchers, deeply concentrated in her district. She delivers for her district. And so, it's important to notice that it is a kind of a honey trap. So not only is there no time limit, but people stay a really long time. We're just about to publish an essay in National Affairs on how long people actually stay in public and subsidized housing. More than 5 years, 89%. More than 10 years, 70%. 10% of New York City public housing residents have lived there for more than 40 years, right? This is not a launching pad for upward mobility. It should be, maybe there's a way to make it that, but it isn't right now. And that was the path that this conservative Republican, was Nixon a conservative? I don't really think so. But the liberals thought he was, set us off when we diverged in 1973 between the moratorium on new projects and the beginning of housing vouchers under Nixon.
You mentioned that there are Democratic politicians who have a stake in this new arrangement, or the modern arrangement of public housing. What has been the response from the Republican Party? How have Republican presidents since Nixon, for example, dealt with the projects, if they've treated them at all?
I think Republicans have, for the most part, ignored the whole thing. The HUD secretary was the only president who paid any particular attention to rebuilding the projects physically, whether that's a good idea in the long term or not, was Obama. The only one who named a HUD secretary who was not, frankly, a token affirmative action appointee, a guy named Sean Donovan from New York. And he developed what's called the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. It's going to get really wonky here, I'm going to be careful, which brings in private money to rebuild the projects. And then they're privately managed. Whether that will be sustainable over time, or whether they'll go downhill the way the original projects did during the Golden Age, remains to be seen. Obama was the only president to take an active interest in what to do about public housing since Nixon, really. And we'll see what the Trump administration does, because Scott Turner, the HUD secretary, is making some very pointed comments about subsidized housing should not be a hammock, it should be a trampoline. Mm-hmm. That's his phrase. Mm-hmm. So he is taking an interest right now. And Trump himself has proposed in his so-called skinny budget, which may or may not get anywhere, a 2-year time limit on public housing. That would be a revolution. Mm-hmm. So he is taking an interest right now.
But nothing's really off the ground, so to speak.
Not yet.
Right. I want to ask you how your work in this book relates to one of your earlier books, Who Killed Civil Society? Because it seems to me that they're connected, that we have here a central authority just destroying entire communities and therefore the civil society that works around them. Did you find any parallel lessons between the two books as you were working on this one?
Oh, I definitely do. And you know, it's weird to do a book of history and get upset about it. But when I think about Southwest Washington or Detroit or St. Louis, all these places, my hometown of Cleveland, a lot of the area where my grandfather sold newspapers on the street, that was torn down for public housing. You know, I really get upset about it. And I think about the connections that people had amongst themselves. You know, in Black Bottom in Detroit, it was named for the rich soil that the French discovered. It was not a racial pejorative. You know, there was the Negro Women's Business League. Wow. Just think about the meetings that they had, the hats that they wore, the introductions that they made. You can just picture it. And it was all swept away by these intellectuals who thought they knew how people wanted to live. And so those civil society rejuvenates, it makes dynamic neighborhoods. Barbershops, churches, on and on and on. You know, the Crawford Grill and the Hill in Pittsburgh. You know, it's just so ironic. August Wilson's probably the most celebrated American playwright of the 20th century. His house is preserved in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, but most of the neighborhood's been torn down and replaced by public housing. Mm. And so jitney was a form of civil society where people crossed paths and played jitney, I'm talking about, if anybody knows it. It's one of August Wilson's plays. People crossed paths as they were dispatching jitneys to pick people up, and they knew each other. All that swept away. Public housing, no businesses, no stores. And so we think of the social welfare state as just payment assistance. But there was this kind of social therapy state that was going to fix people and fix their neighborhoods. And public housing was part of that, and it crowded out civil society, yeah.
What would you say surprised you the most when you were doing the research for this book?
I was surprised what a big deal it was in the Deep South. Mm-hmm. You know, like everybody else, I assumed it was, you know, New York, Chicago, Detroit.
Were the structures in the Deep South as monumental or gargantuan as the ones in the North?
No. They're low-rise courts, they call them. So you would have rows of maybe 2 or 3 story buildings and interior courtyards. And I was surprised not only that it was so present in the Deep South, but that there were mixed race neighborhoods that were torn down, that they replaced. That, you know, and I had the pleasure of digging into census records in southern cities and seeing, because the census at that time would indicate W or N, white or Negro. So you knew who was living next door to each other until they weren't. Mm.
And those southern projects, are they still around?
Oh yeah, very much still around. Yeah. Really, you know, Atlanta, it's mainly a housing voucher city right now, but 95% African American. There's some, Birmingham, 95% African American. You know, the government segregated America, you know, that had redlining and FHA for whites in the north. That's overstated a little bit, that's another discussion. And public housing for blacks.
So let's bring it up to today. I mean, what lessons for today's debate over housing do you draw from your research in this book?
Well, I would advise Mr. Mamdani in New York to back off from building 200,000 new units of public housing, which he has literally proposed. So I would be skeptical of that, I think it's fair to say. I think the main lesson I would draw is that don't look to central planning to solve the housing crisis, if you will. That in the pre-housing era, and I talk about this somewhat in the book, we had the secret formula for housing affordability. And that was small houses on small lots. Modest homes owned by their occupants, 2 and 3 family, 3 family houses in Boston, row houses in Philadelphia, 2 flats in Chicago. These housed American working class en masse. And they were disdained by the reformers. Lewis Mumford, famous social critic, said there'll be no good housing in America until we overthrow capitalism. He said that. He wrote that in the Museum of Modern Art catalog. They were wrong. They ignored what had been happening. It stalled into depression, and they assumed from that the private sector would always fail. And that's a false assumption, and we have to get rid of that.
As you take a sip of water, I'll ask an elaborate question.
Choked on your question, Matthew.
I guess, you mentioned Mamdani, and it raises for me the question of have the politics of public housing changed at all during the past 50 years since Nixon issued that directive that no new projects would be built?
Well, I'm stunned that Mamdani is bringing that back. I think the politics has mainly been focused on expanding housing vouchers, maybe making it entitlement. Matthew Desmond wrote a book called Evicted. He's a big housing advocate, wants to ban eviction nationwide and make housing vouchers a universal entitlement. That's where the energy had been on the left. So Mamdani is kind of coming out of nowhere on that, but we'll see. Public housing started in New York, maybe it'll revive in New York.
But for the moment, you'd say that it's mainly kind of at an equilibrium. We have this dual track system that came out of Nixon, and we have the voucher
The
system.
energy is, from the progressive left, the energy is on banning evictions and making housing vouchers an entitlement, so that anybody who is paying more than 30% of rent is in bad shape and needs subsidy.
I'll be turning to questions in a moment, so we'll get the microphones ready. And if you do have a question and you're watching online, please send it to Hadar Zeevi at aei.org. That's HADAR.ZEEVI at aei.org. Before I do that, though, I wanted to ask you a counterfactual. I mean, you found in your research this remarkable exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. Did you ever consider how the world might look if that exhibit hadn't taken place?
Yeah. I think post-Depression, housing construction would have revived. I think it wasn't the only bad trend that was incipient, though. Herbert Hoover had formed a national commission on housing, which recommended zoning for the entire country. That was a new thing in the 20s. And, it was modest at first. You were going to separate residential from industrial and other things like that. But over time, the combination of local control and zoning has become the means to zone out the kind of housing that I call naturally affordable, small homes on small lots. And so that happened despite or notwithstanding public housing. I think there still would have been a push for low interest mortgages in the federal government, which changed things. But I think, especially with the advent of fair housing, that you wouldn't have seen the worst part of what I found in the book, the destruction of black neighborhoods.
All right, well, we'll turn to questions now. why don't we start with Chuck Lane? If you wait for the microphone to get to you, please.
Thank you. Charles Lane with AEI. Howard, this is a really intriguing subject. I have a quick comment and then a question. My comment is what I was telling Steve earlier, and it goes to your point about high modernism and architecture, and that was really a global movement. If you go to East Berlin, former East Berlin,
Right.
you will see the Marzahn housing development. And if you put a picture of that development next to a picture of Pruitt-Igoe, you will not be able to tell any differences between the two. And these structures are still there in East Berlin, of course. The Red Army did the slum clearance there, but it was the same principle. Build on completely flattened land and put in something that looks great in an aerial photograph. But when you get down to the level, you can see it's not built for human beings. My question has to do with...
Just one quick thing. In Red Vienna, they built the Karl Marx houses, and those still stand today.
Yes. Marzahn is still there, too. A lot of people live in it. The question I had is about the dynamic impact on the rest of a city.
Yes.
From the kind of setting aside, and I believe they're taken out of the local tax base, the setting aside of all this land and all this property for something that's owned by the state, in effect. So what did that do over time dynamically to tax bases and to alternative, or to the competing, so to speak, private housing?
Well, I've written about that in another setting. I call it the frozen city, because the public housing is frozen in that use. And I talk about in the book, for instance, the Ingersoll houses on the Brooklyn waterfront were built to house the Navy Yard workers in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The Brooklyn Navy Yard hasn't been a Navy Yard for a really long time. And now it's kind of a startup industrial park. But those uses are frozen as residential. And so, speaking of Jane Jacobs again, she said that new ideas need old buildings. And Hewlett-Packard proved that, and Steve Jobs proved that, the garages. So the potential uses of Southwest Washington and all these other neighborhoods that were slum cleared were aborted. So that's one aspect. The other thing is the government was competing with private housing by building gleaming new cheap housing. Live here, low rent. That was what they advertised. So that, in a way, contributes to the decline of other neighborhoods because you have unfair competition that's subsidized.
Question there?
Thank you, Howard. I really appreciated your presentation, and we spoke about this topic briefly a couple of months ago here, so I'm really excited to see that your book is ready to go. And I had one kind of zany suggestion.
Are you the gentleman from HUD?
Yes, that's right, sir.
Well, you didn't want to make that clear here. That's okay.
I'm sorry. I am the head of the Office of Policy Development and Research at HUD, so we do lots of studies and things like that. So,
which I relied on, and they're very good.
Yes, thank you. I recommend that you send your book to the Congressional Black Caucus and then carefully document their response.
Okay.
Well, I mean, maybe I can turn that.
I'll just say this. I once testified before the House Finance Committee about housing vouchers, and I talked about the south suburbs of Chicago and how they were becoming concentrated poverty of housing vouchers, and that the black working class was upset about it because black homeowners were suddenly living next door to Section 8 households. She said, "You, sir, are a racist." So that's Maxine's view of me.
Any other questions? Kevin?
The iPad should have.
Oh, yeah, great. We'll take Kevin's first, and then we'll go to the iPad.
Thanks for the book, Howard. Question I have for you is based upon this notion that I picked up in my own little forays into urban politics, which is so much of city politics is real estate politics. And as If that is a fact, then that creates a natural challenge for federal authorities who want to pour money into a city to create housing units, because of course the local interests are going to say, well, we want to hash out where we put this. And in various cases, when you had neighborhoods get bulldozed, it wasn't that the projects were put right back there. Instead, they were put somewhere else where the real estate was cheaper.
Right, exactly right.
And I mean, was that like a central problem for this kind of entire idea of federally funded public housing that kind of tripped things up?
It was a mixed record. Sometimes they did build them in the same neighborhood. Like the Brewster Douglas houses in Detroit went up on what had been Black Bottom. They replaced it. The Pomanock houses in Queens was built on a former golf course. So that was what the real estate developers call a greenfield. So it varied, but I think that interests were always at play. Who owned the land was always at play, but that was intensely local, I think, not necessarily a national decision.
Just a quick question from the internet here. So if some of the displaced residents in the slums owned their homes, but did not own the housing units, did that serve to reduce the level of home ownership among the residents of the slums, among these neighborhoods?
Absolutely, they lost their houses.
Everything.
And I make, I think, an original point in the book, which is we talk about owner occupancy. I talk about something called owner presence. So many of these neighborhoods were replete with 2, 3, and 4 family units in which the owner lived. So talking about social capital and civil society, when your landlord lives on the first floor or the top floor maybe, first of all, the landlord's got to maintain the building because he lives there too. Second of all, you got to behave yourself because the landlord might kick you out. So all of the strictures that come with those kind of tight connections are swept away. And so we see, what do we see in public housing? Disorder.
And then as a follow-up here, do we offer any, are there any policies to offer the units of public housing to the tenants to buy so that they could have some ownership over their homes?
People talk about this, and Jack Kemp tried to do this. I call it lemon capitalism, right? So we're going to give you this great project that was new 50 years ago, and now it's falling down, and now you can own it. Great, what a deal. Do you have any experience managing property? No. So not a good deal. What I would do, frankly, is I'd like to extricate ourselves from public housing. And one way I've thought that's just truly heretical is to buy out the tenants. To say you've faced an opportunity cost for living in this project, you didn't get to own property elsewhere. If you've lived here, we'll pay you X amount for every year you've lived here, and you can get this relocation payment to move out. And we're going to sell this project, sell the land, get out of the business. I think a lot of people would take that offer up. And you know, there are a lot of elderly women. The majority of the plurality of tenants in New York City public housing today are single elderly women. If you said, here's a relocation payment and you can move to Atlanta with your kids who are living there because they moved there too, I mean, I'm being painted with a broad brush, but I've met people like that who moved out of Bedford-Stuyvesant and moved south, and they would do it. So I think there are a number of creative ways. I don't think ownership by the tenants has worked. There have been cooperatives that have been tried. They've always been failures. I don't think that's the right way.
And this is a related question from Les Lankowski.
Uh-oh, now I'm in trouble.
Did you cover in your research the Thatcher's attempt to privatize the council homes? It sounds like you've kind of addressed that in your previous response. Or...
Well, the council houses were quite different because they're small, and their individual ownership to a certain extent made sense there. I think there's tension now over whether those who have been granted the right to own it can sell it and make a profit. And so there's been some tension in Britain about that. And we hear in the United States the same kind of thing about permanent affordability. We're going to subsidize home ownership, but it's going to be permanently affordable. That is, you're not going to be able to realize the appreciation that most people get on their houses. And that's been part of American housing policy as well. So I think Britain is different because you had the small houses, but at the same time, that then offered the chance to sell out.
In front.
Hi. Howard, this is really fascinating.
Oh, that's Adam.
Yeah, you mentioned
I got bright lights here.
you mentioned the embrace of public housing by many Southern political leaders. Were there any parts of the country that did not have a lot of public housing and did not have the slum clearance? And if so, what has happened to those neighborhoods since then? Have they flourished and grown?
Well, there was always less in the far west and California. Some in Los Angeles, but maybe 15,000 units in Los Angeles. It was a much smaller footprint. Kamala Harris in her campaign talked about growing up in Oakland. She grew up in a naturally affordable neighborhood of small bungalows. And those neighborhoods have flourished. The bungalows of California, the two flats of Chicago, at least on the north side, have flourished and gained value. So I think if we had let the slums go about their way, there would have been a natural renovation, sale of some property, and the counterfactual would have been dynamic renewal. And I think it's not so much that neighborhoods that were spared public housing. California is a good example with the bungalow neighborhoods. Sacramento has them too, and even parts of Silicon Valley. But they continued to renew themselves. And that's what public housing lacked the ability to do.
Scott?
Thanks, Howard. This is great stuff. You had mentioned at one point talking about redlining, and that was a bigger question. So I wanted to try to steer things that way. There was a big part of the story, I gather, is this sort of misguided benevolence of progressives at the federal level who thought they were doing this great thing. You have to question a little bit how benevolent folks were who didn't think that there were going to be all these people that were losing their homes when the slums got cleared out. But at the local level, it strikes me there's a sort of darker story.
Definitely.
I'm thinking of Mayor Daley, who. So we know that fairly rigidly enforced segregation predates public housing. In places like Chicago, Mayor Daley, I think, took these funds and built the Robert Taylor homes and took the opportunity to run the Dan Ryan Expressway so that it would separate the Robert Taylor homes from the Irish neighborhood that he lived in on the other side of the highway. Can you say more about the story of redlining and how that played into the history that you looked at?
Well, that's two things, is how the federal mortgage subsidies were not flowing to neighborhoods that were thought to be undergoing racial change, because that was regarded as a risk. That's why they drew the red lines. It wasn't an overt say, well, we don't want blacks and whites living together. It's really fascinating how government made all these mistakes, by the way. Government made these mistakes, just saying. But the Federal Housing Administration, it was their read of America that neighborhoods in which blacks were moving into, where whites had been living, were not going to remain stable. That was their insurance assessment. And therefore, they drew the red line around not insuring homes there because they thought the property values were going to go down, because demand would go down, because there'd be fewer buyers, because whites wouldn't be there. They'd be self-excluding. So that was redlining in in the growing suburbs and in the outer parts of the city. In Chicago, and Kevin Kosar is here, who was the keeper of the flame for the great American political scientist Edward Banfield. Banfield and Adam Meyerson's father wrote one of the great books about public housing called Politics, Planning, and the Public Interest, about the siting, S-I-T-I-N-G, of public housing in Chicago. And the Housing Authority, Robert Taylor, by the way, was the first head of the NAACP in Chicago before he was an infamous public housing name. Ida B. Wells, that project became notorious. She was the famous anti-lynching journalist. Oh, it's just so tragic. But the Housing Authority wanted to disperse the public housing across the city. And there was opposition, working class opposition. There was even working class black opposition, because social class matters a lot. Social class matters a lot to people who have just inched their way up the social ladder too. So there was mainly white opposition. And when you read the newspaper accounts of that white opposition today, you think you're reading a Trump voter's outburst. You know, Reagan Democrats. It was all starting to happen, and it was initiated. And instead, it became the vehicle, just as you point out, not only to focus public housing in the south side of Chicago, but to tear down healthy black neighborhoods like lots of Bronzeville that, you know, were iconic. So redlining became a tool for white-black segregation in the suburbs, and public housing became a tool for segregation in the cities.
Time for one more, Stephen.
Howard, by the way, my name is Steve Pearlstein, and I want to say that I knew Howard when he was a bohemian. So naturally occurring affordable housing. I want to the implication is if you just let the market work, that the market for housing will work as well as the market for tomatoes or lemons, and it'll mostly work. But I wonder whether that's true, and I'd ask you to wrestle with two examples. Imagine your old hometown of Boston or your new hometown, New York. Do you think if there was no public housing subsidy, if all the public housing was torn down and the land was, put on the market and let the market do with it, do you really think in New York City that there would be naturally occurring affordable housing? The opposite is, there was a time in Detroit when you could have any land, the land value was zero for much of Detroit, okay? So there is an example where the market could have had naturally occurring affordable housing in all sorts of places, except it didn't happen. So I wonder if there's something about the underlying fundamental economics of cities at different times in different places that gets in the way of your confidence that the market will pretty much handle these things on its own if you just let it. That there may be times and places where the market won't. I'm not saying that public housing is the answer to that, but it may be a little glib in thinking that the market will handle it.
Well, it's great. I'd like to note that I invited a Democrat, and here he is. And the answer is, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. I think the reason there was no housing built on the empty lots of Detroit, because there was no demand to live in Detroit. And if there had been demand, I think you would have seen a response to it. There are many reasons that housing doesn't get built. It might be zoned single family, large lot, and that would prevent it. That's government intrusion. It's not free market. It might be that it takes 2 years to get a building permit and you have to pay somebody in Detroit. That's a real thing too. It's not a greenfield. There's a reason developers move to the greenfields of the suburb, because they're welcome there. Now, the counterfactual in New York, what would be built there? There is not an endless supply of investment bankers wanting to move into every neighborhood. Even in New York, would certain if you tore down the public housing that Jay-Z grew up in Brooklyn, and let it happen, Captain, and move whatever you want, maybe it would be luxury development. Maybe it would be. But maybe not in the Bronx. What you would have to accept is that there's going to be rich neighborhoods and there's going to be poor neighborhoods. And they're going to be located in different places, and the social classes may not mix. Liberals don't like that fact. It's the true fact of all housing markets. And nobody ever asked poor people, boy, isn't it terrible to live in a poor neighborhood? Wouldn't you like to really rub elbows with rich people? Nobody asked them that. Maybe they feel awkward. I think that's the fact. But that's liberal policy too, is we should mix the social classes and use housing as a means of social engineering to do that too.
That's not
So
my liberal,
I
that's
think
not my
housing would
liberal
be
policy,
built.
but
I think housing would be built,
Yeah.
not in every neighborhood. That would be affordable in every neighborhood.
But you think that the metropolitan area would equilibrate at a particular point where there would be, even with high land value places, naturally affordable housing in New York City, in greater metropolitan
In
Boston?
metropolitan New York, you know, we're already seeing in New York, just as you've seen in Washington, you've seen a displacement of the working class black population from DC to Prince George's County. You're seeing a displacement of the working class black population in Boston to the South Shore of Boston and to Long Island in New York. So then you have to have adequate transportation. And those are ancillary issues. But I think on the whole, the private market would come to an equilibrium if it were permitted to build small houses on small lots, to build for all the rungs on what I call the housing ladder. Yes, I do.
I think we do have one more question right here.
Steve wants to keep arguing.
Well, please.
No, it's a question. I don't know the answer to it.
It's okay.
I really don't. I mean, but I think it's a question. There is sort of major structural economic change going on in metropolitan areas that sometimes results in the market not providing this thing that you say would happen naturally. St. Louis, it didn't happen there either, but it's because St. Louis was dead. The economy of St. Louis was dead. That's the overriding thing there, not the housing market.
Right. I want to get this last question in.
Thank you. I'm Lawrence Regard. A couple of quick comments. There's an NYU campus here in Washington, D.C. on 13th, just south of Logan Circle, and they had a great documentary talking about what happened in southwest to southeast D.C.
Yeah, I've seen some of those films.
Fantastic.
They're really good. It's really heartbreaking, isn't it?
It's very heartbreaking. So I really appreciate the conversation. I look forward to reading your book. And a couple other quick comments. In 1976, I came to go to to New York to go to the United Nations for an event, and we were told not to leave after 9 o'clock at night. So of course, all of us from high school left and went to Harlem, and so struck by, as you talk about, how it was so unlivable. There was just quiet, tall buildings with nobody out and about. It was just so striking to see an area that...
East Harlem, by the way, is the largest concentration of public housing in the United States.
I'd never seen anything quite like that, and that was quite eye-opening. And the last thing, I spent in '78 time in East Berlin in the wintertime and would go to West Berlin to check things out there. And I couldn't get over how much East Berlin reminded me of parts of Harlem, and the skyscrapers and dead at nighttime, no people at all that were out and about, and how striking that was. And just some quick comments. So I'm looking forward to reading your book and learning more.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I believe that Howard is going to be available to sign books if you'd like to get a copy. And now I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you all to thank you, Howard Husock, for your book and for this presentation.
Thank you.